Welcome to the deep dive. Our job here is to move past the superficial narratives, really extract the essential knowledge from the sources you've shared, giving you that shortcut to being truly well-informed.
And today we're tackling something pretty heavy.
We are. It's a deep dive into claims that American history, well, it's been fundamentally distorted, not by accident, but through official, institutional, even ideological means.
Yeah, the sources we're looking at use this really striking phrase, the black hole of anti-knowledge.
It's evocative, isn't it? Suggests crucial facts, especially about, existential threats, just get deliberately sucked out of our collective memory, our history.
Exactly. So our mission today is to explore this historical pattern that's laid out in your material. It alleges this systematic suppression of truth about totalitarian threats.
And it spans quite a timeline.
It really does. From Soviet penetration during the New Deal in World War II, all the way up to, well, the alleged denial of religious motives for jihad after 9/11.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The sources kick off with a, frankly, chilling parallel. It connects these two very different historical periods.
Right. They argue that the kind of cultural pressure, the political taboo that makes it hard to talk frankly about today's threats specifically. They mention Islamic jihad doctrine, that its pressure mirrors exactly the ridicule and censorship, the whole McCarthyism label that basically suffocated anti-communist efforts decades ago.
So it's the same kind of institutional flinch, a refusal to look at something unpleasant, even if it's real.
That's structural similarity. That's the core analytical point here. We're examining claims that American leadership, over time, developed a kind of mechanism for denial.
How does that mechanism work, according to these sources?
It's about severing the connection, taking cold, hard facts, maybe about enemy infiltration or enemy doctrine, and deliberately cutting them off from any kind of moral or strategic judgment that should follow.
Which makes the facts useless in the public square.
Precisely. It creates a vacuum right where an effective defense strategy should be, a real black hole.
Okay, so to understand how this all supposedly started, we need to go way back. Back to 1934, the New Deal era.
Right. Massive government expansion, thousands of new jobs, often filled in a hurry.
And the sources argue this bureaucratic explosion was, well, perfect cover for Soviet penetration.
It starts, according to the material, with Whittaker Chambers. He was working for Soviet military intelligence, the GRU.
And he connects with someone named Harold Ware.
Yes. Ware apparently led a secret, already existing communist network. Very tightly organized, based inside these new government agencies. The sources specifically mention the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, and the NRA, the National Recovery Administration.
So networks were already forming within these experimental agencies.
Seemingly staffed by ideologically sympathetic people, yes. But the strategy, the sources claim, shifted quickly.
Shifted how? From just sympathy to something more active.
Exactly. Chambers was apparently tasked with reorganizing these career communists, moving them out of the temporary New Deal agencies and embedding them into the permanent main departments of government.
And there was a prime target.
The State Department. That was named as the first crucial objective. Get inside the permanent machinery of foreign policy.
And this happened fast.
Astonishingly fast, according to the account. Later that same afternoon in 1934, Chambers met the first member designated for his new reorganized cell.
Alger Hiss.
Alger Hiss. Not just a casual contact, the sources stress, but a deliberate recruitment into what they describe as a hardened espionage unit.
Wow. And Hiss wasn't alone. You mentioned Lee Pressman, John Abbott, Nathan Witt. A lot of these names, the sources note, were Harvard law graduates. This sounds sophisticated.
It does. And the key distinction Chambers supposedly made, and that Vinone intercepts later seem to confirm, wasn't just about ideology. It wasn't just about being left-leaning.
What was it then?
Organizational discipline. Loyalty to Moscow's directives. These individuals were allegedly part of a structure.
The sources quote this description: an amazing, unofficial, popular front government.
Yes. Unrecognized, unadmitted, independent of the administration, yet operating energetically within the New Deal framework.
That implies a parallel government, essentially, with loyalty to a foreign power, influencing policy from the inside out.
That's the core claim, yes.
Yeah.
A staggering one.
Okay. If this level of penetration was happening as early as 1934, surely someone noticed. Someone must have sounded the alarm.
Well, someone definitely tried. The sources detail this really astonishing case, Dr. William A. Wirt.
He was a school superintendent from Indiana?
Gary, Indiana, yes. He became one of the earliest official whistleblowers. And he apparently experienced the full force of this suppression mechanism right away.
What did he claim? What did he testify to Congress about in 1934?
His testimony was explosive. He said he'd met with high-ranking officials inside the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration,
Okay.
and they were openly discussing pretty radical goals. He testified they talked about deliberately retarding the economic recovery, the very recovery the New Deal was supposed to deliver,
Why on earth would they do that?
to intensify public desperation, to speed up the conditions they thought were necessary for a revolution. That's what Wirt claimed he heard.
So deliberate sabotage of the U.S. economy by government officials, that's a huge accusation.
Huge. And it didn't stop there. He said they were talking about using government programs to collectivize American workers, push them into planned communities, basically advocating for the destruction of laissez-faire economics and mapping out a kind of Soviet-style takeover.
Inside the AAA.
According to Wirt's testimony, yes.
So what happened when he brought these facts, these allegations forward? How did the establishment react?
Instantly moved to discredit him, to neutralize the testimony. And the sources argue the tactics used set the template for everything that followed.
How? What did they do?
Well, the Select Committee set up to hear him. 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans voted strictly along party lines, 3-2.
Okay.
And that vote prevented Wirt from doing 3 crucial things. First, he couldn't read his full opening statement. Second, he wasn't allowed his own lawyer. And third, he couldn't rebut the political charges they threw at him.
Sounds like a setup, designed to deny him a fair hearing from the get-go.
That was the explicit goal, according to the analysis. Control the narrative. The committee refused to even call the key administration officials Wirt had named in his testimony.
So they couldn't confirm or deny his account under oath.
Exactly. Which allowed the committee majority to dismiss Wirt's entire testimony as just hearsay, conveniently smacked down by denials in the press, as a dissenting minority report apparently put it at the time.
So the information was quarantined, discredited without ever being seriously investigated.
That's the claim. The mechanism of anti-knowledge in action: attack the messenger to avoid the message, established right there, early in the New Deal.
And there was a postscript to this. Someone admitted it later.
Astonishingly, yes.
Yeah.
Years later, in 1940, former Representative John J. O'Connor, a Democrat from New York, who had actually chaired that very committee, he essentially confessed in newspaper articles.
Confessed to what?
He admitted he had actively helped prevent a thorough investigation of Wirt's charges. Admitted he helped discredit Wirt.
Wow. So direct confirmation of a political fix.
It certainly seems to validate the source's claim that the political system itself was complicit in burying that first major warning of, well, ideological subversion.
Okay, so the New Deal era provided the opportunity for this infiltration. But then World War II comes along and the stakes get, well, global.
And this is where the sources make a truly staggering claim, suggesting that this Soviet influence didn't just stay in mid-level agencies, but reached the absolute summit of American power.
Specifically through whom?
Through Franklin D. Roosevelt's closest advisor, Harry Hopkins.
This is a monumental claim. We're talking about the man who literally lived in the White House.
Yes, lived in the Lincoln bedroom from 1940 to 1943. He functioned, as the sources put it, like a one-man cabinet. Had this uniquely intense and sustained intimacy with FDR. Handled everything: diplomacy, strategy, domestic policy. Unprecedented access.
Which means, if the claim is true, every major decision could potentially be viewed or influenced through an enemy's lens. How did the sources possibly substantiate something this explosive, saying he was a Soviet agent?
Well, the key piece of evidence they cite is an intelligence assessment, supposedly from the Soviet side itself.
Okay.
A top Soviet spy master, Ishak Akhmarov, reportedly considered Hopkins, not Hiss, not Harry Dexter White, not Lachlan Curry, who were later confirmed agents, but Hopkins as the most important of all Soviet wartime agents in the United States.
That's not just saying he was sympathetic. That's an intelligence assessment of his value and role.
Exactly. It's presented as an assessment of operational importance based on his access and influence.
Okay, let's zero in on the most concrete example the sources give of this alleged treason, the atomic leak story. What supposedly happened there?
This was April 1943. J. Edgar Hoover gets intelligence that the Soviet intelligence chief in the U.S., Zarubin, also known as Zubulin, was actively supervising atomic espionage, funneling money to the American communist underground specifically to steal atomic secrets, Manhattan Project secrets.
A critical national security breach. And Hoover briefed Hopkins personally.
Personally briefed Hopkins. Told him what the FBI knew.
And Hopkins' alleged reaction.
According to these sources, outright betrayal. Instead of acting on the intelligence to protect U.S. secrets, Hopkins allegedly turned right around and immediately informed the Soviet embassy that the FBI was onto their operation.
He warned the Soviets.
That's the claim. Blew the FBI's surveillance, compromised their source, their methods, and crucially, this action apparently thwarted General Leslie Groves' immediate attempt to put an embargo on uranium exports.
Uranium for the Manhattan Project.
Yes, an embargo vital to protecting the project's secrets. Hopkins' alleged intervention ensured the Soviets could continue their atomic espionage relatively unimpeded, jeopardizing America's crucial post-war advantage.
If true, that staggering doesn't cover it. Hashtag tag 2.2 Lend-Lease as Soviet strategy.
And this alleged pro-Soviet orientation, the sources argue, translated directly into policy. Policy that massively benefited the USSR, often they claim, at the direct expense of other Allied interests.
You're talking about the Lend-Lease program, the sheer scale of it.
The scale was immense. We basically subsidized the entire Soviet war machine, over 500,000 trucks and jeeps alone.
Which were logistically vital for the Red Army.
Absolutely transformative. Nikita Khrushchev himself apparently confirmed later that this American aid was indispensable for the Red Army's advance all the way from Stalingrad to Berlin.
And it wasn't just vehicles, was it? What else did the U.S. supply that the sources highlight as particularly problematic or disproportionately aiding Soviet aims?
Oh, the lists are vast. Thousands of aircraft, tanks, 13 million pairs of winter boots vital for the Eastern Front, hundreds of thousands of patents, secret military blueprints, just a flood of material and information.
But there's one item the sources really emphasize is chilling.
Yes, icebreakers. The sources point out these were essential to keep the northernmost ports of the Gulag archipelago supplied with fresh slaves.
So American aid was simultaneously helping the Soviet war effort and sustaining Stalin's internal system of repression.
That's the grim picture painted. Helping fight the Nazis on one hand, while propping up the infrastructure of the Gulag on the other.
The sources call this a Russia-first policy. How did they contrast this massive aid flow to the Soviets with, say, the situation for American troops elsewhere?
They use a stark example, the Philippines. Early in the war, 151,000 American and Filipino troops there were left desperately undersupplied, essentially abandoned, while aid was flowing, seemingly without limit, to Stalin.
So the argument is this wasn't just about military necessity.
No, the sources cite contemporary military analysis, calling this unlimited aid to Stalin one of the four great and false premises guiding Allied strategy, suggesting it was driven more by, well, perhaps ideological preference or Hopkins' influence, rather than purely objective military needs.
Okay, this moves us from logistics, supplying things, into grand strategy, the actual shape of the war.
And here the sources make another huge claim, that the choice of where the main Allied invasion of Europe happened, the Second Front debate, was fundamentally influenced by Soviet strategic goals, potentially overriding other Allied, particularly British, or maybe even long-term American interests.
We're talking about the D-Day landings in Normandy, Operation Overlord.
Primarily Overlord in northern France, yes. Followed by Anvil, later called Dragoon, the landing in southern France in August 1944. These were immense undertakings, focusing Allied power on Western Europe.
And how did that specific strategy serve Soviet interests? What was the alternative?
Well, Churchill, as the sources point out, argued strongly for a different approach, focusing more on the Mediterranean, pushing up through Italy, potentially into the Balkans or the Aegean Sea, this soft underbelly strategy.
What would have been the strategic effect of that?
Critically, it would have placed Western Allied troops much further east in Europe as the war ended. It might have contested Soviet control over places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania.
Whereas the chosen strategy, the cross-channel invasion,
geographically guaranteed that Eastern and Central Europe would be liberated, quote-unquote, by the Red Army, left wide open for Stalin's forces, arriving on those American Lend-Lease jeeps to establish political control over half the continent, a major Soviet strategic objective achieved.
A geopolitical victory handed to them, essentially. And how is Hopkins involved in pushing for this specific strategy, the France landings?
The sources paint him as the key political enforcer of the Overlord Anvil strategy within FDR's inner circle. He was apparently deeply suspicious of Churchill's Mediterranean ideas.
There's an anecdote about that.
Yes, he famously scribbled notes to Admiral King during meetings, asking things like, who's promoting that Adriatic business that the president continually returns to? basically signaling hostility to any strategic thinking that didn't align with the focus on France, which ultimately benefited the Soviets geopolitically.
And this strategic influence, the sources argue, went even further. Beyond just where to invade, they bring up unconditional surrender and the Morgenthau Plan.
Right. The policy of demanding unconditional surrender from Germany, which was cemented at the Casablanca Conference, often presented as something FDR just came up with spontaneously. The sources argue this policy perfectly aligned with Stalin's goal of ensuring the total destruction of Germany as a potential future rival in Europe. It removed any possibility of a negotiated surrender that might have preserved some German structure.
And this was amplified by the Morgenthau Plan. Remind us what that was.
The Morgenthau Plan was developed primarily by Harry Dexter White, another Treasury official later confirmed by Venona as a Soviet agent.
Okay.
And its goal was incredibly radical: to essentially pastoralize Germany after the war, dismember it into separate, non-industrial agricultural states, cripple it permanently, eliminate it as a European power capable of resisting Soviet expansion eastward.
That sounds extreme. Did it have practical consequences during the war?
Absolutely, according to these sources. When details of the Morgenthau Plan leaked in late 1944, Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda machine had a field day.
How?
They used it as proof that the Allies intended utter annihilation. It gave German soldiers and civilians a reason to fight on with fanatic resistance, even when the military situation was hopeless. The sources argue this plan, conceived by a Soviet agent and pushed at high levels, directly stiffened German resistance and cost thousands of American lives unnecessarily in the final brutal months of the war.
Yeah.
Hashtag 2.4 active collaboration in Soviet atrocities.
So the betrayal wasn't just strategic, it was also, the sources claim, moral. An abandonment of allies, of principles, even covering up Soviet war crimes. The Katyn Forest massacre comes up here.
Katyn is a truly grim example. In 1940, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, murdered about 20,000 captured Polish officers and intellectuals in the Katyn Forest and other locations.
A horrific war crime.
Absolutely. When the Germans discovered the mass graves in 1943, the physical evidence documents on the bodies, the stated decomposition clearly pointed to the Soviets having done it before the German invasion of 41.
But that wasn't the official Allied line, was it?
No. The official U.S. and British stance became one of active suppression of the truth. They publicly echoed the Soviet lie that the Nazis must have been responsible, all to preserve the alliance with Stalin.
So American and British officials essentially had to lie, or at least publicly distort the truth.
They had to. The sources cite a contemporary report by the British ambassador to the Polish government in exile, Owen O'Malley. It's quite damning.
What did O'Malley say?
He wrote that Allied officials, himself included, were obliged to give undue prominence to the tactlessness or impulsiveness of Poles, meaning blame the Poles for raising the issue, and actively restrain the Poles from putting their case clearly before the public.
Silence the victims.
Exactly. O'Malley concluded with remarkable candor that officials had to appear to distort the normal and healthy operation of our intellectual and moral judgments just to keep relations with the Soviets cordial. Truth was sacrificed for the sake of the alliance.
And the sources suggest FDR himself was involved in this silencing.
Yes. They mention FDR personally forbidding former emissaries, like George H. Earle, who had information about Soviet actions, from publishing anything critical about the ally. But perhaps even more chilling is the suppression of evidence from American soldiers who saw Katyn.
What happened there?
Lieutenant Colonel John Van Vliet was one of a group of American POWs the Germans took to Katyn in 1943 to see the evidence. When he was repatriated in 1945, he gave a detailed, convincing report to Army Intelligence Chief General Clayton Bissell, confirming Soviet guilt.
And Bissell's reaction?
Bissell immediately made Van Vliet sign a secrecy order, directing him to never speak of it. The entire report was stamped top secret and buried. The truth was actively suppressed within the U.S. military itself.
This policy of appeasement, of covering up, it extended beyond Katyn, didn't it? To the fate of millions of refugees and POWs after the war.
Yes. Operation Keelhaul, a deeply controversial and, frankly, brutal operation.
What did Kiel involve?
It involved the U.S. and British military forcibly repatriating nearly 2 million people claimed by the Soviet Union back to the USSR. This included not just Soviet POWs, but also anti-communist Russians, Cossacks, Ukrainians, civilians, women, children, many who had fled communism or fought against it.
People who knew they faced execution or the Gulag if sent back.
Exactly. Alexander Solzhenitsyn called Operation Keelhaul a war crime. The sources describe horrific scenes, mass suicides in Allied camps, like at Dachau, among those desperate to avoid repatriation. Accounts of Soviet troops machine gunning returnees as soon as they crossed the border. It was a direct collaboration in delivering victims back to their executioners.
And this policy of denial, of abandonment, it even touched American lives directly. The sources mention potentially tens of thousands of U.S. POWs who never came back from Soviet custody.
That's another disturbing claim, that as many as 20,000 American POWs captured by the Germans on the Eastern Front might have ended up in Soviet hands and were never returned.
Was this acknowledged at the time?
Apparently not openly. The sources claim General George Marshall ordered censorship of returning American POWs who had negative things to say about the Red Army as early as March 1945.
Wow.
And then General Eisenhower's official report in June 1945 seemed to deliberately downplay the issue, claiming only small numbers of U.S. troops remained in Russian hands, despite internal communications suggesting the problem might be much larger.
So another example of the pattern. Denial, suppression, prioritizing the political relationship with Moscow over truth, even over the fate of American soldiers.
That's the consistent thread the sources trace through this entire period.
Okay, so the war ends, but the story doesn't. The consequences of this alleged subversion, this cover-up, they linger for decades.
Right. The sources argue that this institutional betrayal, this pattern of denial, continued long after the war, even when concrete, undeniable proof of espionage started to emerge.
You mean proof beyond the testimony of people like Chambers or Elizabeth Bentley?
Yes. Specifically, the Venona Project findings, the breaking of Soviet intelligence codes.
Which
Confirmed that individuals like Alger Hiss and Assistant Treasury Secretary Harry Dexter White were indeed Soviet agents. The sources claim that Presidents Truman and later Eisenhower were informed about these findings as early as 1950. They knew.
They knew Hiss and White were agents based on intercepted Soviet cables.
That's the assertion. Yet they failed to publicly reveal the full truth, the full scope of the Venona findings. For years.
Why? Why keep that under wraps? Why allow the debate and the accusations of witch hunts to continue if they had definitive proof?
Well, the sources suggest that revealing the full extent of the penetration, especially reaching into the Treasury and State Departments during the Roosevelt era, would have been politically devastating, a massive embarrassment.
So protecting the past administration, perhaps? Protecting institutions?
Possibly. But the consequence of not revealing it was profound. It allowed the narrative that the anti-communists were paranoid, that McCarthy was just seeing ghosts, to take hold and solidify. The truth that could have vindicated their core concerns was kept classified.
And this failure to act decisively wasn't new, was it? The sources bring up the Eurasia case from 1945.
Right. The Eurasia case is presented as an earlier critical failure. Thousands of classified government documents, many dealing with sensitive U.S. policy towards China, were found in the offices of a small pro-communist magazine, Eurasia.
A major security breach should have led to exposure, prosecutions.
You'd think so. But the sources claim Washington fixers, allegedly led by Lachlan Curry, another official implicated as a Soviet agent, intervened, managed the situation politically.
With what result?
The result, according to this analysis, was that practically the entire secret communist occupation of the U.S. government was saved from exposure. The investigation was effectively quashed.
And the potential consequence of that failure?
Immense. The sources argue that if the network had been exposed then, in 1945, it might have completely altered U.S. policy towards China in the crucial post-war years, potentially preventing the communist takeover there and the subsequent loss of millions of lives. The failure wasn't a lack of evidence, it was a lack of political will to prosecute the system.
Which brings us back to Solzhenitsyn. His point wasn't just about prosecuting individuals, was it?
No. Exactly. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed, Solzhenitsyn argued that what was needed wasn't just trials for specific officials, but something like a Nuremberg trial for the system itself, for the ideology of communism.
Why was judging the system so important?
Because by failing to hold the ideology accountable, by treating it as just another political viewpoint rather than recognizing its inherently tyrannical nature, the core ideas were allowed to survive, to persist, mutate, and potentially reappear in new forms. The failure was in rendering that clear moral judgment on the system. Hashtag 3.2 cultural conditioning and the power of the narrative.
So if the government wasn't prosecuting the system, what was happening in the wider culture? The sources argue the cultural establishment was actively working in the opposite direction, rewriting history, almost.
Yeah, they point fingers directly at Hollywood, for instance, arguing it produced outright pro-Soviet propaganda during the war.
Feels like Mission to Moscow.
Mission to Moscow, Song of Russia. Films that painted a heavily romanticized, sanitized picture of Stalin's Russia as this noble ally, while at the same time, the sources claim, the same cultural forces were censoring stories that show the reality stories about people escaping East Berlin or documenting actual communist atrocities.
There's a striking irony mentioned regarding the Hollywood blacklist later on. People like Dalton Trumbo, often portrayed as martyrs.
Right. The sources point out the paradox. Trumbo himself, before he was blacklisted for his communist affiliations, was allegedly active in suppressing anti-communist works. They claim he gloated about stopping the publication of books like Viktor Kravchenko's I Chose Freedom, a powerful memoir by a Soviet defector.
So the argument is that censorship was happening on both sides, but only one side's narrative, the anti-communist side, became dominant culturally.
That's the claim. And the key weapon used to enforce that dominance, the sources argue, the thing that really silenced inquiry for generations, was the term McCarthyism.
How did McCarthyism become such an effective tool of suppression?
It became the ultimate conversation stopper, the third rail. You know, if you could label any investigation into communist influence, any concern about subversion, as McCarthyism, you didn't have to engage with the substance of the concern. You just dismissed it as paranoia, extremism, a witch hunt.
So it functioned as an intellectual gag order.
Effectively, yes. The sources assert ensured that any serious, objective reevaluation of the espionage that McCarthy and others warned about espionage we now know, thanks to Venona and other archives, was very real, became professionally dangerous, fatal to a career in academia or mainstream media.
And this narrative got cemented, didn't it? Reinforced through things commonly taught in schools, like Arthur Miller's play The Crucible.
Exactly. The Crucible, using the Salem witch trials as an allegory, became a standard text. It powerfully framed all congressional anti-communist efforts as irrational, hysterical persecution.
Even though the historical reality, as revealed later, was quite different.
Completely inverted, the sources argue. Venona confirmed that many of the key figures targeted Hiss, White, the Rosenbergs, many others, were actually guilty of conspiracy and espionage. They weren't innocent victims of paranoia.
But the cultural narrative stuck.
It stuck hard. The accusers, however flawed, who were raising legitimate concerns based on real evidence, are still widely portrayed as the villains. While the documented agents are often treated with a kind of historical ambiguity or even sympathy, this successful inversion, the sources argue, is the ultimate triumph of creating that black hole of anti-knowledge. The facts get buried under layers of cultural narrative. Hashtag tag 3.3, the new moral equivalence.
And this leads us to what the sources see as a major cultural consequence. This blurring of lines, this failure to distinguish between fundamentally different systems. They call it moral equivalence.
Moral equivalence, yeah. It's the idea that, well, maybe the West wasn't really that different from the Soviet bloc. Both sides had spies, both kept secrets, both played rough. So who are we to judge?
Where did this idea gain traction?
The sources point to popular culture, particularly the sophisticated espionage fiction that became popular during the Cold War. Think John le Carré, for example. His novels often portrayed this murky world where the distinctions between MI6 and the KGB, between Western values and Soviet methods, seemed to dissolve into shades of gray.
Suggesting a fundamental similarity between a constitutional republic with a Bill of Rights and a totalitarian police state.
Precisely. It fostered a mindset where criticizing the Soviet Union too harshly seemed, well, unsophisticated, unfair even, leading to that anecdote the sources mentioned.
The one about the weather.
Yeah, where a diplomat supposedly quipped, you could hardly say it was cold in Russia without being accused of being anti-Soviet. It captures that atmosphere of enforced neutrality, where stating even basic negative facts became politically suspect.
So the goal here, according to this analysis, was really about language, controlling the terms of debate.
Yes. Deliberately decoupling facts from their obvious implications, making it impossible, or at least unfashionable, to pass clear moral or political judgments.
And this was helped along by the idea of convergence.
Convergence theory was huge. The notion that the U.S. and the USSR weren't fundamentally opposed, but were actually evolving towards each other. The U.S. would become a bit more socialist, the USSR a bit more liberal, and they'd meet somewhere in the middle.
Which sounds reasonable maybe on the surface.
Perhaps. But the sources argue it served as a powerful ideological justification for making concessions to the Soviets, for appeasement, for downplaying the threat. Why stand firm against an enemy who's inevitably becoming more like you anyway? It eroded the will to defend distinct Western principles.
So this long process, initial penetration, the wartime complicity, the post-war failure to prosecute, the cultural conditioning, the moral equivalence, it all adds up to what? A weakening of our ability to see threats clearly.
A systemic weakening, yes. A surrender of the tools needed to make clear, reality-based distinctions between liberty and tyranny. And the sources argue this failure, this neutralization of the anti-communist lexicon, paved the way, set the blueprint for how the next major totalitarian threat will be handled.
Which brings us right up to the post-9/11 era. How did that same machinery get applied then?
Well, the parallel drawn is stark and direct. The argument is that the exact same template used to essentially whitewash communism, controlling the language, inverting the narrative, suppressing inconvenient facts, was immediately deployed to manage public understanding of radical Islam after 9/11.
And again, the core target was the same, obscuring the enemy's actual ideology.
Precisely. The sources claim that official policy-making circles across both the Bush and Obama administrations actively worked to deny or eliminate the specific religious teachings of Islam, and particularly the doctrine of jihad, from any official analysis of global terrorism.
How do they do that? How do you eliminate an ideology from the analysis?
Through language control, a massive linguistic overhaul, essentially. The government, according to these sources, codified a whole new lexicon designed specifically to avoid mentioning Islam or jihad in connection with terrorism.
Substituting them with what?
Vague, deliberately neutral terms. Violent extremism, workplace violence in some cases, even man-caused disasters. The sources argue these terms were chosen specifically to obfuscate the religious motivations clearly stated by the terrorists themselves, crippling our ability to understand why they were attacking.
This denial reached some pretty extraordinary levels, didn't it? The sources mentioned James Clapper, the director of national intelligence.
Yeah, in 2011, D&I Clapper publicly proclaimed the Muslim Brotherhood an organization whose explicit goal is the establishment of a global caliphate governed by Sharia law, whose motto includes "Jihad is our way." He proclaimed them to be a largely secular organization.
Just secular, the Muslim Brotherhood.
That statement, coming from the very top of the U.S. intelligence community, is presented by the sources as Exhibit A, proof that ideological necessity, the need to maintain the Islam as peace narrative, had completely overwhelmed factual reality.
And this wasn't just rhetoric. It affected actual policy and training.
Deeply. The sources detail what they call the Great Jihad Purges within government agencies. FBI training materials, Department of Defense manuals, anything that accurately discussed core Islamic concepts relevant to understanding the enemy, concepts like jihad, sharia, taqiyya, or deception. These materials were systematically scrubbed, removed entirely.
Why? What was the justification for removing factually accurate descriptions of the enemy's doctrine?
The stated reason was often to avoid offending Muslim communities or partner organizations, but the sources argued the effect was to deliberately blind our own analysts, agents, and soldiers to the actual motivations and strategies of the enemy they were facing. Accuracy was sacrificed for political correctness.
And this blindness extended even to battlefield analysis in Iraq and Afghanistan.
It seems so. The sources cite examples like a major counterinsurgency briefing on the Iraq surge by expert David Kilcullen. 90 slides detailing the environment, but reportedly not one mention of Islam or jihad doctrine.
Instead calling it.
Instructing audiences to think of it as a conflict ecosystem, like it was just a natural phenomena devoid of human ideology or religious drivers. Similarly, General Stanley McChrystal's major 2009 assessment of the war in Afghanistan again, reportedly no substantive discussion of Islam or jihad as motivating factors for the Taliban or al-Qaeda.
So we were fighting wars against religiously motivated enemies, but officially forbidden from using the vocabulary that accurately described their motivation.
That's the core argument, a deliberate institutional self-blinding, mirroring the earlier refusal to honestly confront the ideology of communism. Hashtag 4.2 dimitude and the triumph of concealment.
Why? Why this intense institutional drive to deny the obvious reality? The sources introduce a concept here called dimitude. How do they define that? It's not just a historical term.
No, they use it in a broader, more cultural sense. Not just the historical legal status of non-Muslims under Islamic rule, but as a kind of cultural, mental, even spiritual condition.
A condition affecting whom?
Affecting non-Islamic societies, like ours, when facing sustained pressure or influence from Islamic groups or ideologies. The markers, they argue, are recognizable. Self-censorship, supplication, appeasement, self-abnegation, and especially a deep silence about threatening aspects of the other side's doctrine or behavior.
And this condition, this dimitude, is driven by a political necessity, a need to believe something specific.
Yes, the need to believe what the sources call the big lie, that Islam is peace, period, full stop.
And to maintain that belief.
You have to discard inconvenient facts. Facts about historical Islamic expansionism, concepts like religious supremacism within the doctrine, the historical practice of slavery, the totalitarian aspects of political Islam under Sharia law. All of that has to be ignored, downplayed, or explained away to maintain the comforting, politically required narrative. Truth becomes subordinate to ideology.
Which ultimately leads, they argue, to the surrender of our own ability to think clearly.
Exactly. It's the same mechanism Arthur Koestler describes so powerfully when analyzing communist tactics, linguistic reconditioning.
How did Koestler put it?
He said, not only our thinking, but also our vocabulary was reconditioned. Certain words become taboo. Saying Soviet agent became dangerous. Saying jihadist or linking terrorism to Islamic doctrine became Islamophobic. Once you control the vocabulary, you control the thoughts that can be expressed, maybe even the thoughts that can be thought.
This creates the apology reflex.
Yes, an instinctive urge to excuse, downplay, or apologize for the actions of those motivated by the threatening ideology, while simultaneously policing the language used by your own side.
And how does this play out practically in society today beyond government policy?
Well, the sources suggest we see it everywhere. Law enforcement leaders hesitant to name religious motives. School principals censoring historical narratives. Media outlets framing terrorist attacks in ways that obscure ideology. Academics avoiding sensitive topics. It creates an institutional paralysis where drawing logical conclusions from evidence becomes fraught with social and professional risk if those conclusions violate the established narrative.
So the mind itself becomes conditioned, controllable, once the vocabulary for critical analysis is taken away or made taboo.
That's the ultimate danger highlighted. Whether it's Marxist ideology or radical Islamic ideology, the sources argue the primary tactic is the same. Reconditions the target population's language and thought so they cannot accurately name, understand, or ultimately resist the threat.
They mentioned that quote from the Madrid train bombers.
Yes, you love life and we love death. A stark declaration of a fundamentally different worldview, rooted in a specific ideology. The sources argue that when we in the West deny or ignore the ideological source of statements like that, we render ourselves incapable of formulating an effective response. The surrender isn't military, it's intellectual and moral first. #tag outro.
So let's try to pull this all together. What does this pattern mean? We've traced this line the sources draw from the Ware Group and the New Deal, through the strategic choices and betrayals of WWII like Lend-Lease and Caton, the failure to prosecute after the war, the cultural silencing via McCarthyism, right up to the post-9/11 language purges. What's the common thread?
The common thread, according to this analysis, is a continuous, seemingly institutionalized betrayal of facts. A structural refusal, embedded in American leadership and culture, to acknowledge the defining truths about totalitarian ideologies, be it communism or radical Islam, and crucially, to hold those truths up to moral judgment.
And the truth tellers throughout this history.
Consistently punished. Whittaker Chambers, Elizabeth Bentley, Dr. Wirt, those American POWs who saw Caton, the anti-communists smeared by the McCarthyism label, even analysts today trying to discuss jihad doctrine.
Honestly, they often face silencing, discrediting, career assassination.
So this refusal to confront uncomfortable truths, to defend maybe the core principles of liberty against these ideologies, it's left us with a distorted view of our own history.
Profoundly distorted, the sources argue. We struggle to make sense of the world because key parts of our historical reality have been deliberately obscured or inverted. This leaves us vulnerable, unable to learn from the past, susceptible to the next iteration of ideological warfare.
Which brings us back to that Solzhenitsyn quote you mentioned earlier.
Yes. His insistence that to really grapple with the history of communist extermination, you couldn't just be inquisitive, you had to be judgmental. You had to apply moral reasoning to the facts.
And the sources are arguing we've systematically failed to do that, sacrificing judgment for political convenience or ideological comfort. That's the core argument, that this constant subordination of moral judgment, this refusal to call things by their proper names, has cost us dearly in terms of clarity, security, and maybe even our understanding of ourselves.
It leaves us with a final provocative thought, doesn't it? If we continue down this path, constantly choosing comfortable narratives over hard truths, what vital part of our current reality or our future might be the next thing to vanish into that black hole of anti-knowledge?
A sobering question to leave our listeners with.